Our learning target today is I can determine whether sampling methods are valid. Mrs. Statter is studying Spry Middle School students to see which brand of ketchup students prefer. Instead of surveying all students, because that would take a really long time to hunt down every single student and survey them, she surveys a group of 60 randomly chosen students. In this scenario, the population is Spry Middle School students. But Mrs. Statter only surveys a sample. Her sample size is 60. Mrs. Statter wants to make sure her sample is representative of all Spry Middle School students. She needs to collect a random sample. Every student at Spry Middle School has to have an equal chance of being selected. And the selection of student needs to be independent of each other. She needs to collect an unbiased sample. So no part of Spry Middle School should be favored over others. So this basically means that everyone at Spry needs to have a chance of being selected. It can't just be 7th graders. It can't just be Red House. Everyone in the school has to have a chance of being selected, and she's going to randomly select 60 students. There are 3 types of unbiased sampling methods that Mrs. Statter could perform. Simple random sampling, systematic random sampling, and lastly, stratified random sampling. Take a second and make sure you write down each of these words. Let's discuss each of these sampling methods and give examples of how Mrs. Statter could use each sampling method to survey Spry Middle School students. First, let's start with simple random sampling. Description. Each item or person in the population is as likely to be chosen as any other. Example number 1. Mrs. Statter could put all student names in a hat and choose, how many students did we say she was going to choose again? 60 student names. Now, this would take a really long time, but probably there's some way to do this electronically with all the students' names, and then you just randomly choose 60 students' names. Everyone has a chance of being selected, but only 6 students are selected at random. Example number 2. Mrs. Statter could use a random number generator and choose 60 student ID numbers. So she could put all of your ID numbers into this generator and have the computer pick 60 numbers at random. Everyone would have a chance of being selected, and the computer would randomly select 60 student numbers. These are examples of simple random sampling. Now let's talk about systematic random sampling. Each item or person is selected according to a specific time or item interval. So we have to set a rule for systematic random sampling. Here's an example. Let's say there are 1,020 students at Spry, and Mrs. Statter wants to survey 60. She divides 1,020 divided by 60, and she gets 17. So Mrs. Statter could survey every 17th student from an alphabetical list of all Spry Middle School students. So she got a list of all the students' names, and she chose every 17th student. She would comb through the entire population of Spry Middle School, so everyone would have an opportunity to be chosen, but every 17th person would be chosen until she got 60 students. Okay, the last method of random sampling we're going to talk about is stratified random sampling. Description. All items or people are divided into groups, and a random sample is equally selected from each group. So in this kind of random sampling, we have to set up groups. For example, there are 3 houses at Spry. So what if she picked an equal amount of students from each house? She divides 60 divided by 3 and she gets 20. So for a stratified random sampling, Mrs. Statter could survey 20 students from each house. She set up groups by house and she's going to select 20 students from each house. Example 2. There are 6 lunch periods at Spry. There's 3A, 3B, 4A, 4B, and 5A, 5B. So she could ask everyone at Spry by doing 60 divided by 6 and getting 10. So she could survey 10 students from each lunch. Everyone has a lunch, so everyone would have an opportunity to be selected, but she's going to select 10 students from each lunch. That's an example of a stratified random sampling. So, going back to these valid sampling methods, simple random sampling would be choosing a name out of a hat or using a simple number generator. Systematic random sampling would be making a rule, like choosing every 100th pencil or choosing a donut every 4 minutes. If you set up a rule, that's systematic. Stratified random sampling is splitting everyone up into groups and picking an equal amount of each group, like choosing 4 students from each grade level or choosing 2 students from each homeroom. If you set up groups, that's an example of stratified random sampling. So I'm going to have you guys pause this video, go to the next slide, and watch this little video that I made years ago about these 3 different sampling methods. Then come back to this video and watch the remainder of this video. Okay, I hope you're back. So we're on slide 59 now. Bruegger's Bagels wants to ensure the freshness of their bagels. Which sampling method are they using in each scenario below? Check 2 bagels of each flavor. Okay, so this says of each flavor. That's an example of putting the bagels into groups by flavor and checking 2 of each group. Which of these sampling methods groups the population first? Stratified. Next, checking a bagel every 2 minutes. Okay, they came up with a rule. They're going to check every 2 minutes. That's an interval of time. Which of these split up the population by a rule? Systematic. Checking every 40th bagel that they bake. Okay, there's another rule. It's going to be every 40th bagel. Which of these has the population split up by a rule? Systematic. Checking 4 bagels out of all available bagels. So there's no rules, no grouping. This is just a simple random sample. Checking 3 bagels baked by each employee. This means they're going to group the bagels by employee first. Which of the sampling methods groups the population first? Stratified. Now let's talk about biased or bad sampling methods. Mrs. Statter decides to survey the first 60 students to eat lunch during Block 3A. Is this a valid sampling method? No, this is not valid. Asking the first 60 students to eat lunch during Block 3A, does everyone in the school have a chance to be selected? No, because only 6th graders eat lunch during Block 3A. Only 6th graders would have a chance of being sampled. So this is a biased sampling method. Mrs. Statter decides to survey 60 of her own students. Is this a valid sampling method? Would everyone at Spry Middle School have an equal chance of being selected if she surveys just her own students? No, because Mrs. Statter doesn't teach all the students at Spry Middle School. Only her students would have a chance of being sampled. Mrs. Statter puts out 60 surveys and asks for volunteers to complete the surveys. Is this a valid sampling method? No. The sample needs to be randomly selected. You can't ask for people to volunteer because you're not going to find a random sample. Pause this page if you need a second to write down any of these answers, but I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay. Beware of invalid sampling. Here are some examples of biased sampling methods, which are bad. A convenience sample is choosing a sample that is easily accessible but not random. For example, if you just surveyed your friends, that would not be a random sampling. That would be a biased convenient sample. It's very convenient to survey people you know and people that are easily accessible to you, but that's not a random sample. Voluntary response sample. A sample that is self-selected. These samples tend to have a strong opinion on the topic, which leads to a biased response. For example, if you leave a survey out for whoever wants to participate, the responses you get back are not random and they could be very biased in nature. Okay, target practice. Which of the following samples would be most representative of the entire student population? A, surveying every 5th, 7th grader who enters the library. B, surveying every 5th student who enters the library. C, surveying every 5th student who enters the school. Or D, surveying every 5th girl who enters the school. Pause the video and see which sample you think is the most representative of the entire student population. Okay, you should have picked C. I wouldn't pick this one because this is only 7th graders. I wouldn't pick this one because it's only people that enter the library. And I wouldn't pick this one because it's only girls.